still ticking above the sink. The kitchen clock was the only sound when my own grandson, the boy I raised after his parents died, looked up from his phone and said, "You're just waiting to die." As the second hand scraped forward, I didn't cry, didn't speak. I just folded his favorite napkin the way I used to when he was 6. While that soft plastic tick grew louder than his breath, I listened to him joke about my will, like I was already gone, like I couldn't hear. The same clock that once timed his bottle warmings now counted every breath he hoped I'd stop taking. That's when I realized he wasn't family anymore. He was a quiet thief, waiting for my last blink. So I let the clock keep ticking, just long enough to erase him from everything I ever built in his name. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Frances stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the gray sky. The rain had come earlier, slanting down in thick, steady sheets, turning her small front yard into a patch of mud. She could see the outline of her neighbor's faded blue house through the mist, just barely. She'd been thinking about the attic all morning. It had been years since she'd gone up there. Most of the old boxes had remained untouched, bundles of memories she'd never quite gotten around to sorting. Her husband's war medals, the ceramic angels she used to paint, Evan's first baseball glove, the scrapbook she made for their wedding anniversary. It was all still up there, hidden under dust and time. Frances pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and walked to the phone. She picked it up and dialed Evan's number, her fingers slow as she punched in the numbers. It rang 4 times before he picked up. "Hey, Grandma," Evan said, his voice thick with distraction. "Evan, it's Frances," she said, her tone steady but deliberate. "I was wondering if you'd come by sometime this weekend and help me clean out the attic. I'm getting to the point where I can't do it all on my own." There was a long pause on the other end. She could hear a muffled sound in the background, Kimber's laugh maybe. The noise made Frances's stomach tighten. She didn't mind Kimber, but she could tell how little either of them saw her. The quiet tension always hung in the air, unspoken. Finally, Evan sighed. "Why bother? You're just waiting to die anyway." The words hit her like a slap. For a moment, the room seemed to spin. She felt the floor drop out from under her, her grip tightening on the phone until her knuckles turned white. "What did you say?" Her voice trembled despite herself. Kimber's awkward chuckle echoed in the background, as though to brush the moment off. "Never mind," Evan said quickly, as though already over the moment. "I'll see if I can swing by later." But the distance between them felt larger than ever, more defined by that simple, careless remark. Frances put the phone down slowly, the dull buzzing in her ear echoing in the stillness of the room. She felt small and cold. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding on to, hoping for a little attention, a little acknowledgement. That small shred of hope shattered now. Her legs felt stiff as she made her way to the kitchen table, still empty of all but a cold cup of tea she'd left untouched since morning. She sat down heavily, staring into the murky brown liquid, watching the way the steam evaporated into the air. It seemed so pointless now. Her mind replayed Evan's words, each one echoing, louder with every loop. Waiting to die. She swallowed thickly. She hadn't expected this. Not from him. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. She blinked, surprised. Who could it be? Lorna, perhaps? Frances stood up, legs unsteady. As she opened the door, she saw her old friend standing on the porch, her raincoat pulled tight around her, her hair pulled back in its usual no-nonsense style. Lorna stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, and Frances closed the door behind her. Lorna gave her a sympathetic look. "What happened?" she asked, eyes already scanning the room. Frances didn't speak at first. Instead, she walked back to the kitchen table and sat, still holding the cup of cold tea in her hands. She felt as though the room was closing in on her. "Evan," she choked on the words. He said I'm just waiting to die." Lorna's gaze sharpened. She didn't speak right away, but Frances could see her eyes flicker, calculating. Lorna had always been like that, quick to assess, slow to react, but when she did, it was sharp. "Well then," Lorna said quietly, leaning against the doorframe, "don't leave him anything but silence." The words struck Frances with a sudden clarity. It was as though something inside her had shifted, the final piece falling into place. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision, the shift in power, the shift in everything. "I think I'm done," she whispered. Lorna's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "I think you are." The sound of rain against the window suddenly felt louder, like a drumbeat. Frances's mind was made up now, and the future felt closer than it ever had before. The attic smelled of musty wood and forgotten things, a strange mixture of dust and time. Frances climbed the narrow stairs slowly, her hand trailing along the old banister, the groan of the wood underfoot echoing in the silence. The house had always felt full of life, full of memory, his memory. But lately it felt as though that life had quietly drained away. Everything had become quieter, smaller, like the rooms were closing in on her. When she reached the top, she switched on the light, but the bulb flickered a few times before giving way to a dull glow. Dust swirled in the air as she moved, the beams of light cutting through it like ghosts in the haze. She'd avoided this space for years, ever since her body began to feel the weight of age. But today, something inside her pushed her upward. There were things to face, things she'd left behind, memories she had hoped would stay tucked away. Her eyes scanned the cluttered room, the old boxes piled high along the walls, each one filled with memories. Old photo albums, worn school books, toys, and clothes. She knew the contents of every box, every item. These were pieces of her life, pieces of his life. She had kept them all. She stopped in front of the cedar chest, its surface worn and scuffed from years of being moved and shifted. Kneeling in front of it, Frances slowly opened the lid, and a rush of memories poured out. Inside were the baby clothes, the little shoes, and the tattered blanket she had used to swaddle him when he was just a baby. But it was the bundle of baby teeth that made her pause. Frances had kept them all, each one wrapped carefully in tissue with a note marking the date of their loss. She unfolded the paper slowly, her fingers grazing the small white teeth. Each one a relic from a time when he needed her, when he believed in her love as a constant, unshakable thing. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of those days in the pit of her stomach. That boy, the one who had clung to her after his parents' funeral, his face tear-streaked as he clutched her coat, terrified of being alone. That boy is gone. In his place was a stranger who barely looked her way, who had no time for the memories she held so dear. She set the bundle down gently, as though to not wake the ghost of him she had lost. Then she opened a few other boxes, rifling through old keepsakes, wedding photographs, and birthday cards. The attic, once a treasure chest of love, now felt like a graveyard. She didn't know when it had happened, when the boy she'd raised had become so distant, so removed. But the truth was clear. He was no longer the child who had needed her. Frances's hand found the old power of attorney papers, yellowed and brittle from age. She opened the file slowly and scanned the document. Her name was listed at the top, but beneath it, Evan's name. She had trusted him with this, with everything. She had wanted to trust him, but now, the words felt like an anchor. He would take over if she was ever incapable of managing her life, her affairs. He would be the one. Her stomach turned. She had thought of him as her legacy, but now she realized how foolish she had been. He had never seen her as anything but someone to discard. The boy she had raised, the boy who had clung to her when he was small, had long since been replaced by this indifferent man who barely acknowledged her existence. Frances set the papers down, her fingers brushing against the pen she kept in the drawer nearby. It felt heavy in her hand, like a weight that had been building for years. She pulled a sheet of paper toward her and began to make a list. Evan is named on the deed to the house, the insurance policy, the joint bank accounts. She listed everything, every tie that bound him to her, every inheritance she had once imagined leaving him, thinking he would honor it. The thought made her stomach churn. It was all going to him. All of it. Why? Her hand shook as she wrote, but she didn't stop. Each word was like an unspoken goodbye to the boy she had once known. Then a sudden clarity washed over her. Lorna had told her once, "Don't leave him anything but silence." Her gaze flickered toward the phone on the table. Frances hesitated only a moment before picking it up and dialing the number she had kept for years. Jonah Reed, her old estate lawyer. It had been a long time since she had needed him, but today something was different. Jonah answered on the third ring, his voice calm, efficient. "Frances, how can I help?" "I need to make some changes," she said, her voice even but determined. "Evan. He's no longer listed on anything. I want him removed. All of it." Jonah didn't ask for explanations. He simply said, "I'll get the paperwork started." Frances hung up, her heart beating faster now, but her mind was clear. The future had just become simpler in a way she hadn't imagined. It wasn't the future she'd once planned, but then again, nothing had turned out the way she'd imagined. As she sat there, the old list in front of her, Frances made a quiet vow. Evan would no longer have access to her life. He would no longer be a part of the legacy she'd worked so hard to build. The doorbell rang, and Frances stiffened. She had set the table with care, plates polished, silverware aligned, and the cloth napkins folded just so, but the weight of the evening had already settled over her. She knew what was coming. She always knew. Evan and Kimber arrived late, as usual, the car door slamming behind them like a punctuation mark. Kimber was the first to walk in, her bright smile already in place, but her eyes darted around the room, scanning the empty space. She was carrying nothing, no flowers, no dessert, just herself, which, as far as Frances could tell, was the only thing she ever brought. "Sorry we're late," Kimber said, her tone breezy, as though they'd only just finished an errand, not driven across town. Her eyes lingered on Frances for a moment, then quickly flicked away, her mind already elsewhere. Frances nodded, her smile tight. She'd long ago stopped expecting more. Evan followed behind her, his gaze briefly flicking to the table before he slouched into his seat, his jacket hanging loosely from his shoulders. He didn't meet her eyes, his focus already on his phone, fingers scrolling mindlessly. He mumbled a greeting, but it was more of a sound than an actual word. Kimber chuckled nervously, a sound that barely masked the awkwardness hanging between them. "It's not easy, you know," she said, glancing at the empty chair at the head of the table, "trying to get everyone together for a family dinner." Frances's stomach tightened, but she said nothing. Dinner proceeded with the slow, practiced rhythm of 1,000 previous meals. Kimber chatting about work, Evan half listening, responding only when directly addressed. Frances sat at the head of the table, feeling more like an observer than a participant. The warm glow from the overhead lights cast long shadows over the table, and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen seemed louder than the conversation around her. Kimber took a bite of her salad, then put down her fork and leaned back in her chair, looking over at Frances. "I was thinking," she said, her voice light but tinged with something almost too casual. "Maybe it's time to put Grandma in a better place, you know." Frances's hand stilled over her plate. Her fork hovered above the mashed potatoes, but she couldn't quite bring herself to take another bite. Evan chuckled, his eyes still glued to his phone, and for a moment, Frances didn't know if he was laughing at Kimber or at her. Either way, it didn't matter. The laughter sounded hollow, distant. Kimber smiled, pleased with her own joke, but Frances only stared at the potatoes in front of her. Put Grandma in a better place. She had heard those words before, from people who didn't know her, from people who didn't know what it was to be here, to have lived all this time, to have fought for every inch of what she had. Her mind was already elsewhere, already making a list. After dessert, the quiet stretched. Kimber was scrolling through her phone now, probably checking Instagram or making plans for the weekend, things that didn't include her. Frances knew this, knew the game. "Could you take the trash out, Evan?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Evan glanced up from his screen, eyes briefly meeting hers, and then rolled his eyes. "Yeah, sure," he muttered, as though the request were an inconvenience, not a simple favor. He pushed back from the table with a grunt and got up, his feet dragging. Frances didn't watch him leave the room. She stayed seated, her fingers lingering on the edge of her plate, her mind elsewhere. Kimber didn't even look up. She had already lost interest, absorbed again in her phone screen. Frances took a slow breath, and then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, she reached for a small post-it note on the corner of the table. She scribbled 3 words, Call Jonah tomorrow. The words, though simple, were like a declaration of independence. When Evan came back into the room, he was already on his phone again, muttering something about work. He didn't look at her when he passed. Frances didn't mind. She didn't need his gaze anymore. She had already made her decision. And the family tree she had once nurtured, once believed in, had begun to wither in her hands. She could feel it. The roots were gone. The leaves were already falling. The office was quiet in the way only old buildings could be. Each creak of the floorboard a whisper of things overheard and never repeated. Frances sat with her back straight, the leather chair beneath her stiffer than she remembered. Her coat, damp from the morning drizzle, hung behind her like a discarded skin. Across from her, Jonah Reed adjusted his glasses, flipping slowly through the manila folder she'd handed him 10 minutes ago. He hadn't spoken much, but she could feel the judgment moving silently behind his eyes. "Everything's intact," he finally said, tapping one page with a pen. "Evan and Kimber stand to inherit the house, the remaining investments, even the lake property." A pause. "And Evan has full medical power of attorney if anything were to happen." Frances folded her hands in her lap. Her voice, when it came, was clear, steady. "Not anymore." Jonah looked up. The fluorescent light glinted off his glasses, but she saw his eyebrows rise. "I see," he said slowly. He closed the folder. "Then we'll need to revoke the existing will and trust, draft new medical directives, reassign the executor." "Lorna," Frances didn't wait for him to finish. "She's my neighbor, known her 20 years. She brings my groceries, checks my gutters without me asking." "You want to know what she brought to the last family dinner?" A thin smile flickered at her lips. "Apple pie, still warm." Jonah nodded, making a note. "And for alternate decision-maker, should anything medical come up?" "Lorna," she repeated. "All of it. If I can't speak for myself, I trust she won't treat me like I already stopped breathing." Silence stretched between them as Jonah typed. The rhythmic clacking of the keys filled the room, efficient and final. Frances watched him work, watched the careful deletion of names that once meant everything. He slid a new sheet toward her. "Do you want to include a letter? Something they'll read after you're gone. Sometimes people find it helpful." Frances didn't hesitate. She took the paper and pen with hands that no longer trembled. Her handwriting was slow but deliberate. "You spoke like I was gone. Now you'll live with what I left behind." She set the paper down and pushed it toward him. There was no emotion in her face now, only the calm that follows after something breaks and is left unmended. Jonah picked it up, skimmed the lines, then placed it gently on top of the documents. "Once this is filed," he said carefully, "it's final." "That's the point," Frances said. He nodded, then pressed a button on the intercom. "Julie, can you notarize something?" Frances didn't move. Her gaze had shifted to the window. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung low, like the sky hadn't quite made up its mind. She liked that. She understood that. A knock on the door. She turned toward the sound, but her mind was already somewhere else, imagining Evan's face, Kimber's silence. The echo of an empty house after a truth finally lands. Jonah opened the door, and on the other side, Lorna stepped in. Frances's eyes didn't widen. She smiled. Frances didn't answer when Evan called. Not the first time, not the third. His name blinked across her screen with a smug kind of persistence, like it expected to be answered, like it had never learned how to live in silence. She let it ring until it didn't. Then she tied on her apron. The crust came out perfect, golden, edges just a little uneven, like she used to make when Evan was 6, and thought a lopsided pie meant it had more love in it. She crimped the top with the back of a fork, dusted it with cinnamon sugar, and let the smell fill the corners of her kitchen. There was something sacred in the simplicity of it, like she was reclaiming a ritual that had once belonged to everyone, but now was entirely her own. She wrapped the pie in foil, placed it gently into the carrying tin, and walked it 3 blocks to the community center. The wind tugged at her sleeves, dry leaves chased her heels, but her steps never faltered. Inside, the front desk volunteer, a young man with wiry glasses and an open face, looked up with surprise as she stepped in. "Hi," she said, setting the pie down. "Do you still take food for the weekly dinners?" Absolutely, he beamed. This looks amazing. I'd also like to sign up, to help, serve, clean, whatever you need. He handed her a clipboard. She filled it out without hesitation, her pen scratching across the lines with the certainty of someone who had made up her mind a long time ago. By the next morning, Lorna was at the kitchen table, sleeves rolled up, a laptop open between them. Frances had pulled every folder, every bank statement, every dusty envelope from the shoeboxes in the hall closet. They sorted through decades of documents, accounts that had once felt immortal, like furniture or wallpaper. Now they looked like loose ends, and Frances had no interest in leaving anything dangling. This one, Lorna said, circling a number on the screen, still has Evan listed as secondary. Frances leaned in. Call them. They spent hours in the limbo of hold music, flutes, violins, the occasional robotic voice insisting, "Your call is important to us." Frances took notes. Lorna asked questions. Together, they unwound a tapestry that had been quietly tightening around Frances's life for years. Access given casually, thoughtlessly, at a time when love had felt safer than doubt. "You sure you want to close the safety deposit box?" Lorna asked later that afternoon, after they'd eaten sandwiches with too much mustard and no complaints. Frances nodded. "He had a key, once." She paused. "I don't remember giving it to him. That's the worst part." She went to the bank in person. The vault was colder than she remembered, and the box heavier. Inside were only 3 things: her mother's locket, a sealed envelope of cash from 1998, and the deed to the lake property. She took them all and handed the box over to the woman behind the desk. "I'm closing it," she said, effective immediately. The woman typed something, then looked up. "Do you want to destroy the key?" Frances pulled it from her coat pocket, its teeth worn smooth by years of sitting in a dish by the front door. She handed it over without ceremony. As she walked out, her phone buzzed again. Evan. She didn't check the message. Not until she was home, unbuttoning her coat in the quiet hallway. "Hey, need to talk. Can we swing by Sunday?" She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the delete button. And then she noticed something else. A voicemail. New. From him. The timestamp was from this morning, while she'd been transferring the last of her savings into the new account. Under her name, alone. She pressed play, and what came out wasn't a request. It was a demand. "Mom, I don't know what's going on with you, but we need access to the trust. This isn't funny anymore. If you're not thinking clearly, we might have to step in legally. Call me back." She stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then she pressed delete and walked into the kitchen. She had a new pie to make. It showed up between a casserole recipe and a photo of someone's golden retriever. An ultrasound. Black and white, grainy as moonlight. Frances didn't follow Kimber online, but she didn't need to. The post had found its way to her feed like gossip does, threaded through mutual friends and old neighbors. "Baby Parker coming June," the caption sparkled with emojis, hearts, bottles, confetti. And in the second photo, Evan stood behind Kimber, his hands on her shoulders, grinning like a man reborn. Frances stared at the image for a long time. She could almost hear the words forming in Kimber's head, the self-satisfied cadence. "Now she'll have to forgive us. We're family again." Frances turned off her phone. The kitchen was still, the afternoon light pale and thin through the lace curtains. A fly buzzed lazily near the window pane and died there, quiet and insignificant. When Lorna arrived that evening, she didn't bother knocking. She just stepped in with a tin of soup and that soft frown she wore when she already knew bad news. "They're expecting," Frances said simply, setting her phone on the table like a weapon laid to rest. Lorna's sigh was low, but not surprised. "You know what they're hoping now." "I do," Frances said. "They think a baby changes the math." Lorna pulled out a chair and sat, folding her hands on the table. "What are you going to do?" Frances looked past her, to the pie cooling on the counter. The smell of cinnamon still hung in the air, warm, familiar, misleading. "Make sure that child never grows up believing greed is love." The next morning, she was back at Jonah Reed's office. He looked mildly startled to see her again so soon, but when Frances laid her folder on the desk, his expression softened into something close to admiration. "Another revision?" he asked. Frances nodded. "If Evan has children, They're to be excluded from the estate. No exceptions. Jonah paused, pen in hand. That's uncommon, but not impossible. I'm aware. She leaned forward slightly. Instead, I want a vocational fund created at the high school, the one on Belmont, for teen parents. Those kids need a shot at building something real, not just inheriting it. Jonah adjusted his glasses. That's generous. It's logical, Frances replied. I don't want my legacy to be entitlement. I want it to be a choice. When she left the office, the autumn light had softened, golden against the brick sidewalks. She walked slower than usual, letting the crisp air sting her cheeks. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel erased. She felt rewritten. A week later, Lorna found her at the kitchen table again, but this time the papers spread before Frances weren't financial statements. They were stories, lined notebook pages, single-spaced on the old typewriter she'd kept for decades but hadn't touched since her husband's passing. Goodness, Lorna murmured, peering over her shoulder. What's all this? Memories, Frances said. True ones, about raising Evan, about what it cost. She read aloud a line she'd just written. He never knew that the hardest part of motherhood isn't letting go, it's realizing they were never looking back. Lorna's eyes softened. You should share these. Frances smiled faintly. Maybe I will. 2 months later, she did. Her story, The Year I Raised a Stranger, won second place in the county writing contest. The check wasn't much, but when she signed it over to the high school's new vocational fund, the principal's voice cracked as he thanked her. It'll mean the world to these kids, he said. I hope it means more than that, Frances replied. I hope it means they see the difference between earning and expecting. She left the office with the wind at her back and the faintest ache in her chest, the kind that comes when something finally settles right inside you. When she got home, the answering machine light blinked red. One new message. Evan's voice again, but softer this time, hesitant. Mom, we wanted you to hear it from us, but I guess you already know. Maybe you could meet the baby, just once. Kimber thinks. Frances pressed delete before he could finish. Then she sat down at her desk and began typing a new story. The title, The Future I Wouldn't Be Written Into. Frances didn't respond to the voicemail, but when Lorna asked if she was going to, she nodded. I'll think about it, she said. The same way someone says I'll sleep on it when they already know they won't. But she didn't think about it. Not really. The next morning, she wrapped a scarf around her neck and slipped her notebook into her coat pocket. It was barely past dawn, and the sidewalk still held the quiet chill of night, but she needed the space, the air, the distance. She walked past the houses she'd known for 30 years, past the cafe where Evan had spilled hot chocolate on his third-grade report card and cried like it was the end of the world. When she reached the park, the benches were still damp from early dew. She chose the one near the rusted swing set and pulled out her pen. She wrote in silence, the words coming in steady rhythm. I won't be the ghost in the corner of someone else's photo. I won't hold a baby to prove I'm worth remembering. I won't be brought out like a fragile ornament at holidays and tucked away once the table's cleared. She underlined the last sentence twice. Then she closed the notebook and exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for decades. When she got home, she opened the jewelry box in her bedroom, the one she hadn't touched since her husband died. The silver necklace lay coiled like a sleeping memory inside. It had belonged to her grandmother, then her mother, then her. She used to think it would go to Kimber or a future granddaughter, but not anymore. She placed it in a velvet pouch and set it by the front door, ready for donation. Some young woman would find it in a thrift store one day, hold it up to her throat, and give it a new story. Frances didn't need it to hold her place anymore. That evening, Lorna pulled into the driveway with her usual efficiency, already honking once before Frances even opened the front door. Senior Center's doing game night, she said through the open window. Bingo, cookies, maybe a few off-key karaoke attempts. Let's go be scandalous, Frances smirked. You say that like I didn't already win bingo 3 weeks ago. You did. But you sulked through it. This time, you're laughing. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Frances said, but she got in the car. The Senior Center smelled like old upholstery and sugar cookies, and someone was playing Sinatra on a dusty speaker in the corner. They each got a card, a marker, and a seat near the fire exit. Frances didn't expect to win again, but she did. 5 in a row, diagonally, clear as day. She hesitated just long enough to scan the room, then called out, "Bingo," and the room erupted in polite applause. Someone handed her a mug with cocoa and a candy cane stirrer. Another woman offered her a knitted scarf from the prize table. Frances laughed, really laughed, and the sound startled her. She hadn't heard herself like that in months. Later that night, the cocoa pot whistled on her stove, while Lorna fed paper after paper into the shredder in the corner of the kitchen. Bank statements, trust documents, photocopies of Evan's old ID. Each one crackled as it vanished, strip by strip, like the sound of roots being pulled clean. "You sure you want to toss this one?" Lorna asked, holding up an envelope marked Authorized Joint User, Evan Parker. Frances took it, read the name one last time, and fed it through the machine herself. "I'm sure." They sipped cocoa in silence, the kind that felt earned. Then the doorbell rang. Neither of them moved. It rang again, and Frances, without even standing, said quietly, "That door isn't mine anymore." Frances never liked the duplex on 8th Street. It had been her husband's idea, a smart investment he'd called it back in '91, when property taxes were low and his back was still strong. She kept it after he passed, out of inertia more than sentiment. But the place always smelled like damp carpet and other people's regrets. Now it smelled like freedom. She stood in the backyard, the grass brittle underfoot, as a woman from the transitional housing nonprofit signed the final paperwork. Her name was Claudette, no nonsense, cropped hair, blazer in summer heat. She spoke plainly and didn't fidget. Frances liked her immediately. "This'll fund 6 new units," Claudette said. "All for women over 60 who've aged out of their marriages, jobs, or usefulness, at least in the eyes of the world." Frances handed over the envelope, her signature still wet on the cashier's check. "Then let them age into something better." She'd included a note, folded neatly and paper clipped to the check, in memory of women who were always expected to give and disappear. Not this time. Jonah Reed was waiting with a fresh folder when Frances arrived. His office was warmer now, or maybe it was just her. He gestured to the leather chair she always took and handed her a pen. "This," he said, tapping the thick packet, "makes everything final. The estate, the trust revisions, the directives, the donation clauses. It's sealed, legal, irreversible." Frances didn't even glance at the papers. She just signed her name with a slow, deliberate flourish. "Do you want to send notification to the family?" She shook her head. "They'll notice eventually." They noticed sooner than she expected. Back home, her phone buzzed on the counter as she sliced an orange. The screen lit up with Evan's name, again. No voicemail this time, just a text. "Any updates on the will?" "We're working on baby stuff. Just trying to plan ahead." She didn't open the message. She didn't need to. The preview gave her all she needed. Plan ahead. Frances deleted it with a single swipe, then wiped her fingers on a dish towel and moved on. That evening, Lorna showed up with a folded sheet of printer paper and a grin like she'd won something. "Movie night," she announced. "My treat, you pick." Frances raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" "Last time you picked, we watched a French documentary about urban solitude. I cried for 3 days. Frances laughed, the sound sharper now, unburdened. "Comedy," she said. "Let's give your tear ducts a break." They sat in the back row of the old theater on Maple Street, where the seats still creaked and the popcorn tasted like childhood. The movie was about a widowed retiree who fakes her way into a dance competition. It was absurd, heartwarming, a little unhinged, everything Frances hadn't let herself feel in years. She laughed out loud at the scene with the broken heel and the emergency tap shoes. Lorna snorted beside her, almost choking on her milk duds. For 2 hours, the world outside didn't exist. Not the texts, not the estate, not the names she'd erased or the silence she'd chosen. Just the movie, just the moment. When they got back to the house, the porch light glowed soft yellow. Frances lingered on the steps, hands in her coat pockets, watching the wind stir the dried leaves in the gutter. Lorna looked up at her, studying her face. "You okay?" Frances nodded. "Better than okay." They stood like that for a moment, 2 women in their twilight years, sharing warmth like a secret. Then Frances's phone buzzed again. This time, she didn't even look. She just powered it off completely. Lorna noticed. That him again? Frances smiled. Doesn't matter anymore. She opened the door, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like her door, unbothered, unanswered, free. But inside, on the table just beneath the mail slot, lay an envelope, unmarked, no return address. Frances picked it up. The handwriting was unmistakable. Evans. She didn't open it. Not yet. It happened on a Tuesday. Frances was stepping out of the post office, clutching a manila envelope full of writing contest forms, when Evan's car pulled up to the curb. Too new, too polished, the kind that announces success before you've even opened the door. He didn't smile as he stepped out. He just walked up, envelope in hand, as if this were something routine, like picking up dry cleaning or paying a bill. "Hey," he said, voice casual, too casual. Frances stood still. Evan looked older than she remembered. Maybe it was the sleep deprivation or the guilt, though she doubted he'd name it that. He held out the envelope like it was neutral territory. "Kimber's shower is next Sunday," he said. "Everyone's pitching in. Registry's inside, but thought you might want to, contribute." Frances didn't flinch. She took the envelope, held it lightly like it might dissolve in her fingers. "I already have," she said. Evan blinked. "Oh, great. Thanks. I'll let Kimber know." Frances didn't say anything else. Evan lingered a moment longer, as if waiting for some signal that never came. Then he gave a half-hearted smile, nodded, and walked back to his car. She didn't watch him drive away. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, the registry envelope unopened on the counter beside her. Instead, she filled out a donation slip to the Community Development Fund, specifically earmarked for the women's program at the local shelter. She wrote it in the baby's name, for a future built, not inherited, from someone who gave you the only thing she ever truly owned, her choice. She sealed the envelope with calm fingers and slipped it into the outgoing mail pile. Then she placed the baby shower invitation in the shredder and let it vanish without a sound. Frances never sent an RSVP. She didn't buy a gift. And on the day of the shower, she didn't get in her car, didn't call, didn't even glance at her phone. Instead, she and Lorna spent the afternoon in the attic, knee-deep in dust and boxes that hadn't been opened in a decade. "Do you want to keep the christening gown?" Lorna asked, holding up the tiny linen scrap, still faintly sweet with lavender soap. "No." Frances placed it gently in the pile, marked for donation. "Photo albums? Send them to the Historical Society." She held up one with worn leather edges. "Let them be artifacts, not heirlooms." They sorted everything. Old family Bibles, a pair of wedding toasting glasses, yellowed report cards, medals from Evan's long-forgotten swimming days. All of it went into boxes labeled clearly, historical value only. Frances taped each one shut with finality. That night, as the wind crept under the eaves and the smell of cinnamon lingered from the apple crisp they'd baked, Frances sat by the fireplace with a cup of tea and her old notebook. She didn't write, not tonight. Instead, she watched the flames flicker and let the silence hold her, not empty, but earned. Her phone buzzed once on the end table. "Evan, you didn't show up. Are you okay?" Frances stared at the message. For a moment, she considered replying. Just a single sentence, maybe. Something kind, something clean. But the truth was, she didn't owe kindness where clarity was required. She marked the message unread. Then she turned off her phone and left it on the table, the screen fading to black. As she stood to refill her tea, a knock came at the door. Not loud, not rushed. Frances paused, her hand resting on the kettle. Outside, the knock came again, soft, persistent. This time, she opened the door. And standing on the porch wasn't Evan. It was Kimber. Alone. Kimber didn't say anything right away. She just stood on the porch, hands tucked into the sleeves of a pale cardigan, eyes wide in a way Frances hadn't seen before. Not calculating, not expectant. Just human. Frances didn't invite her in. After a long moment, Kimber swallowed and said, "He doesn't know I'm here." Frances leaned a shoulder against the doorframe. "Then you might want to say whatever it is before he does." But Kimber didn't have a speech, not this time. She looked down at her shoes, then back up. "I found the check, the donation." Frances said nothing. Kimber hesitated, her voice quieter now. I wanted to say I read your story, the one in the paper, about Evan, about you. Frances lifted her chin a little. You're not wrong, Kimber added. About any of it. That was the only thing Frances needed to hear. So she nodded once and said, Good night, Kimber, and closed the door with a quiet finality, not cruel, just conclusive. By Sunday, the air had turned dry and sharp. Frances brought out the space heater for her writing nook and opened the folder labeled Fragments. Some were typed, others handwritten. There were pages about Evan's first fever, about teaching him to drive in the rain, about the day he threw a glass at the wall when she'd said no to a loan. There were good memories, but not all of them. She wasn't interested in nostalgia. She wanted the truth. By the end of the week, the printer hummed for nearly an hour. 3 copies, each bound in navy linen, gold title embossed on the front. What I remember, the version that includes me. 1 copy she walked over to the public library herself. The archives director, a quiet woman named Barbara, accepted it with reverent hands. We'll keep it with the local author collection, she said, placing it gently beside a binder of war letters and a memoir from the town's first female postmaster. The 2nd copy she gave to Lorna over pie and strong coffee. You wrote your own record, Lorna said, her fingers trailing over the cover. They'll never be able to rewrite you now. Frances only smiled. That was the point. The 3rd copy she sealed in a manila envelope. Inside, she tucked a note written in her cleanest cursive, To whom it may concern. This is the version that includes me. She brought it to Jonah's office the next morning. This, she said, sliding the envelope across the table, gets attached to the will. Jonah raised an eyebrow. Want me to mark it as supplemental testamentary material? No, she said. Mark it as permanent. He gave a slow, respectful nod. Understood. The invitation came a few days later. A pale cream envelope, formal script. Thanksgiving at Evan and Kimber's. You're always welcome. Frances stared at the words. She noticed the lack of a name. Not Dear Mom, not even Frances. Just the address, printed cleanly. Almost like it had come from a service. She tore it in half without opening the RSVP card. Then she baked a pie. Not for them, but for the shelter downtown. Pumpkin with nutmeg and clove. She dropped it off just before lunch and signed the volunteer book without a second thought. That night the kitchen was warm, filled with the scent of cloves and Lorna's knockoff cider. Frances sat at the table with her mug, a blanket around her shoulders, the manuscript open beside her. Do you regret it? Lorna asked gently. Frances didn't answer right away. She ran her fingers across the edge of the book, soft and worn from use already. I regret who I was when I still thought they'd choose me, she said at last, but not who I became when I stopped waiting. She reached for the pen beside her tea, opened the book to the first blank page at the back. Then slowly, she began to write. But before the second sentence could form, the doorbell rang. This time, it wasn't Kimber. Frances stood. Through the frosted glass, a figure waited, still, silent, and holding a baby. Frances didn't open the door all the way. She didn't need to. The woman standing on her porch was young, maybe 20, maybe younger. Cradled in her arms was a baby wrapped in a thick yellow blanket, cheeks flushed, mouth slack with sleep. Kimber sent me, the girl said. She said you should at least meet her, just once. Frances looked down at the child, tiny, serene, unaware of the lineage of silence and rewritten truths wrapped around her. I'm not part of this story, Frances said softly. She closed the door without anger, without hesitation. The next day, her face showed up online. A photo she hadn't known existed. Grainy, mid-laugh, taken during a city fair 5 years ago. The caption was less blurry. When your own mother doesn't even want to meet her first grandchild. Granny was toxic. Then another post, this one a carousel. A baby's sock, a half-written thank you card, a shot of the nursery. All framed by a long-winded paragraph in Kimber's faux inspirational tone about setting boundaries with those who weaponize guilt. Frances didn't comment, didn't reply, but she read them, all of them. Some strangers chimed in with sympathy, others with scorn, but the worst were the ones who just nodded and typed, "Yup, been there." They think silence equals guilt, Lorna said 2 nights later, handing her a bowl of potato leek soup. It doesn't, Frances gave a quiet smile. It also doesn't equal permission. She tucked the phone away in the drawer and reached for her notebook. That evening, she drafted a letter by hand, folded it twice, and addressed it to Jonah. Release everything 1 month after my funeral. The manuscript, the letters, the financial disclosures, all of it, no sooner. Let them mourn what they never understood before they learn what they never knew. She signed it with her full name. No mom, no grandmother, no softened corners. Just Frances Delaney Parker. By the following week, the decision was final. She sat across from the board director of the local nonprofit housing trust, a woman named Margie who had once been a tenant there herself. The papers were already drawn. This house will go to an older woman exiting the care system, Margie said. Maybe 2. We retrofit for roommates sometimes. Good, Frances replied. It should hold laughter again. She signed the deed over with a calm hand, not as a loss, but as a liberation. Do you want to attach a note or plaque? Margie asked. Frances considered it for a moment. No. Just make sure the windows open easily and the porch light works. That night, she and Lorna sat on that same porch, wrapped in cardigans and an old quilt, sipping cider as the neighborhood children screamed with joy at their dusk games. Across the street, Mrs. Kearns brought over butternut squash soup in a mason jar. The couple next door dropped off a tin of butter cookies with a note that read simply, "You're seen. You're loved." Frances accepted it all. The final estate plan arrived on a Wednesday, neatly couriered in a thick envelope with Jonah's familiar seal. Everything was there: revisions, notarized signatures, trust transfers, the timeline for the release of the sealed manuscript. Lorna watched as Frances flipped through the pages. You okay? Frances didn't answer immediately. She traced one line with her finger. All prior wills and directives are null and void. She nodded once. I'm not okay, she said finally, but I'm settled. And for her, that was more than enough. That night, after the soup had cooled and the porch was quiet again, Frances picked up her phone for the first time in days. There were more posts now. Another quote graphic from Kimber, repurposed photos, a GoFundMe for unexpected childcare expenses. Frances turned the phone off, and this time she meant it. She walked into her study and pulled the last copy of her book off the shelf. She flipped to the final page, blank. Waiting. Then she wrote, I wasn't erased. I just stopped asking to be remembered by people who never really saw me. She set the pen down. And then the landline rang. No caller ID, but her body still remembered the voice. She picked it up, and Evan said, You didn't have to make it public. The envelope came by certified mail, a thick stack of paper-stamped Superior Court of Cumberland County. Frances stared at it for a full minute before setting it unopened beside her coffee cup. She didn't need to read the first line to know what it was. When Jonah called later that afternoon, his voice carried the kind of restrained irritation that only lawyers who've seen too much stupidity can muster. They filed a pre-probate claim, he said. Evan and his wife, alleging undue influence, financial instability, diminished capacity, the works. They even cited your book as evidence of emotional imbalance. Frances took a slow sip of her coffee. They think the truth makes me unfit. They think silence makes them safe, Jonah replied. She almost smiled. Then I suppose this will be educational. He exhaled. Don't worry, we'll handle it. I've already sent the court-certified documentation, updated directives, psychological evaluations from your doctor, notarized estate revisions, the property transfer filings. Everything is sound, Frances. Ironclad. Good, she said. Let them learn what it feels like when paperwork doesn't bend. 3 weeks later, the hearing lasted less than 15 minutes. The judge, an older woman with tired eyes and no tolerance for theatrics, flipped through the petition, tapped her pen once, and looked directly at Evan. This claim presupposes a death that has not occurred, she said flatly. Your mother is not deceased. Your claim is both premature and, frankly, predatory. The gavel came down like punctuation at the end of a very short sentence. Case dismissed. By the following morning, Jonah had emailed the summary judgment and an additional note. filed a protective motion under the new Elder Estate statute. Evan Parker's name is now formally added to the no contact order regarding estate harassment. You're safe to live your life without further interference. Frances read it twice, not out of disbelief, but out of satisfaction. Then she printed the message, folded it, and slid it into her journal between 2 pages dated years apart. On the next blank line, she wrote, "He tried to bury me before I stopped breathing, but I am still here, and the dirt doesn't stick." She closed the book gently, as though the words inside had earned their rest. When her 82nd birthday came around, she didn't plan a celebration. She expected quiet, maybe tea, maybe a long walk, but Lorna had other ideas. By mid-afternoon, Frances's house was full of voices. Not family, friends. The kind she'd made from the community center, the housing trust, the library. Claudette from the nonprofit arrived with a bouquet of paper white lilies. Mrs. Kearns brought deviled eggs. Someone even smuggled in a cheap karaoke machine, though mercifully, no one used it. Frances watched from her armchair, a soft shawl around her shoulders, as the laughter moved through her house like sunlight. It was the first time she'd seen this many people in her living room without tension pressing on the air. Lorna stood near the cake, vanilla, dusted with powdered sugar, 8 candles in the shape of an 82 because we don't do math after 70, she joked. When the song ended, Lorna handed Frances a small flat package wrapped in brown paper. "Open it before you pretend you don't like presents," she said. Inside was a simple wooden frame. The photo within was faded but full of motion. The 2 of them at the senior center, laughing so hard one of Frances's bingo cards was mid-air. Frances chuckled softly. "You kept this? You think I'd let you forget the night you yelled bingo before the last number was called?" Frances's eyes warmed, the laugh lines deepening. "I wasn't wrong, just early." They both laughed until tears formed, the kind that sting but heal. As evening fell, the last guest left with leftovers. The candles long melted into soft puddles of wax. Frances and Lorna sat on the porch, the sky bleeding into lavender dusk. 82, Lorna said quietly. "You've earned peace." Frances nodded. "Peace I have, but something tells me the story's not done." From inside the house, the phone rang, 3 times, insistent, mechanical. Jonah's name appeared on the caller ID. She answered, her hand steady. "Frances," he said, voice unusually tight. "Something's been filed again, but not by Evan this time." Frances's brow furrowed. "Then who?" There was a pause. Paper rustled on the other end. Jonah sighed. "Kimber. She's petitioning for guardianship." The petition sat unopened on the kitchen table for 2 full days. Not out of fear. Frances had long since stopped granting fear that kind of real estate. It sat there because she already knew what it said. Kimber was trying to take her name while she was still breathing. Trying to step in as a guardian, claiming Frances was confused, manipulated, isolated. The irony wasn't lost on her. "I know what this is," Frances said aloud to no one. "It's the sound of someone banging on a door I already walked away from." She slid the envelope into a drawer. Then she picked up a notepad and made a new kind of list. Not a to-do list. A let-go list. The first thing she gave away was her mother's music box. She'd always imagined leaving it to a granddaughter, but now she wrapped it carefully in tissue paper and handed it to Delia, the young woman from the library who'd helped bind her manuscript. "My mother played it every Sunday after church," Frances said. "You're the only one I've met who still listens to Chopin on purpose." Delia's hands trembled when she took it. "Are you sure?" Frances smiled. "Things don't have to stay in the family to stay meaningful." From there, it was easy. The hand-painted teacups went to Mrs. Kearns, who hosted neighborhood garden parties. The quilt her husband had proposed under went to the shelter, along with a note. "Stitch your next chapter beneath this." Every item had a story. She gave each story away on purpose, out loud, by name. By the end of the week, her shelves had space between things. Her closets breathed. Her home, hers, felt full without being crowded. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, Frances read aloud at the community center. Children curled onto bright mats and listened like her words were string lights pulled across the ceiling. Some of them asked if the stories were real. She always smiled and said, "They're as real as you are." One afternoon, a little girl named Ava tugged on her cardigan and said, "You talk like books are people." Frances knelt to meet her eyes. "That's because the good ones are." The cookbook was Lorna's idea. They were drinking cider again when she floated it across the table like a dare. "Not a memoir," Lorna insisted. "Not another damn reflection, just recipes." Frances raised an eyebrow. "Just recipes?" "Well," Lorna hedged, "recipes and reasons. You know, like roast chicken for the night they didn't come home." Frances laughed so hard she nearly spilled her drink. They called it meals with no one waiting. They tested dishes on Saturdays, typed anecdotes on Sundays. One of the recipes, lemon bars for telling the truth too late, made it into the draft 3 times. Neither of them deleted the duplicates. On a gray morning that hinted at rain but never delivered, Frances sat on the porch and scrolled through her contacts. She found his name, Evan, still saved under just that. No emoji, no sun, just a string of letters tied to years of wait. She hovered for a moment. Then she tapped delete contact. There was no ceremony to it. No warning, just gone. She didn't tell Lorna, didn't write about it, didn't mark the moment in her journal, because there was nothing left to say. That night, the wind came in softer than usual. Frances sat by the fire with the latest pages of the cookbook and a warm blueberry scone from a neighbor who still believed in thank you gifts. She didn't hear the phone ring, because it didn't. There were no texts, no posts, no letters, only silence. And for the first time in years, it didn't feel like exile. It felt earned. It felt good. She closed her eyes, exhaled, and whispered just once into the room, "I am not waiting anymore." Then she turned out the light, but in the darkness, a small red light blinked on the answering machine. One unheard message. Time stamped 2:14 a.m. She stared at it for a long moment and didn't press play. Frances began her morning the same way she always did, with a cup of black coffee, 1 sugar, no cream, and the quiet hum of her old laptop. The cursor blinked against the white page of a document labeled Final Draft, Obituary, Personal Copy. It wasn't morbid work. It was maintenance. She scrolled through what she'd written years ago, lines her husband had drafted before his own death, phrases about devotion and family that had aged poorly. She highlighted them, one by one, and pressed delete. In their place, she typed, "Frances Delaney Parker lived long enough to be heard. She loved language, quiet mornings, and the satisfaction of ending a story on her own terms." She reread it 3 times, then saved it to a folder called Truths. When she closed the lid, there was no weight in her chest, only clarity. Jonah arrived that afternoon, his usual briefcase in hand. He placed a sealed envelope on the table between them. "Everything's prepared," he said. "Upon your passing, the letters, the manuscript, and the estate records will be released automatically. 1 copy to the court, 1 to the archive, 1 to Lorna." Frances nodded, eyes steady. "No earlier." He shook his head. "Not a word before. Your wishes are ironclad." "Good," she murmured. "People never listen until it's too late. I'm just making sure too late finally works for me." Jonah gave a faint smile. "I'll make sure it does." Later that week, Lorna came by with paperwork and a casserole she'd claimed was mostly edible. Frances signed the forms transferring medical power of attorney, simple, direct strokes of a pen. "You sure about this?" Lorna asked softly. "It's a lot of responsibility." Frances met her eyes. "You've been deciding what I eat, what I wear, and when I rest for 3 years now. Might as well make it official." Lorna laughed, but there was a shine to it, a gloss of understanding between women who knew how final the word official could be. When the signatures dried, Frances leaned back. "Promise me one thing," she said. "When the time comes, no dramatics, no Facebook tributes, just pie." "Pie," Lorna repeated. "Got it." The baby was born in late April. Frances didn't hear about it directly. The news drifted through town like smoke. Snippets caught at the library, whispers at the market. Someone said the baby had her eyes. Someone else said she looked exactly like Kimber. Frances neither confirmed nor denied. She didn't send flowers, didn't knit a blanket, didn't write a card. Instead, she opened her notebook and wrote a single line under the date. "Some beginnings aren't meant for my attendance." Then she closed it and went back to editing recipes. By early summer, the cookbook was done. The cover was simple, white linen, black font. A title that made people pause, Meals with No One Waiting. The dedication read, "For anyone who learned to feed themselves after being starved of love." She printed 10 copies, tied them with twine, and delivered them to the women's shelter on a humid Wednesday morning. Claudette met her at the door, smiling wide. "Still writing new chapters, I see," she said. Frances handed her the stack. Not chapters, recipes for survival. When the house finally sold, Frances spent her last evening there, walking from room to room. The echoes no longer stung. The walls didn't whisper. In the kitchen, she ran a hand over the countertop, where countless arguments had begun and countless pies had cooled. Then she placed the keys on the counter, each one lined up neatly: front door, shed, mailbox, attic. Outside, the porch light was still on. She hesitated, then flipped the switch off. Lorna waited by the car, engine idling softly. "Ready?" Frances nodded, slipping into the passenger seat. For once, yes. As they pulled away, the house receded in the rearview mirror until it was nothing more than a square of shadow against the streetlight. Frances didn't look back. But when they reached the end of the block, she opened her purse, pulled out her journal, and wrote just one line on the inside cover: "They won't see this coming." Then she smiled, small, certain, and closed it for the last time. Frances died on a Thursday, 83. It was quiet, the kind of death people say they hope for but rarely get. No hospital beeping, no family performing grief in plastic chairs. Just her breath slowing between dreams, a window cracked slightly to let the night in. A wool blanket pulled neatly over her shoulders. When Lorna found her that morning, the tea kettle was still full. Frances had set out the spoon, the mug, and a tiny handwritten note that read, "Cinnamon, not ginger." "I learned that too late." Lorna didn't cry. Not then. She just turned off the stove, folded the note into her pocket, and sat beside her friend until the sun crept through the blinds. It wasn't peace, not exactly. It was ownership. Frances had made her ending hers. 3 days later, Jonah walked into Evan's office unannounced. He didn't shake hands, didn't offer a seat, just laid a thick envelope on the polished mahogany desk. "What is this?" Evan asked, brow furrowed. Confused in the way people are when they realize the control they thought they had was imaginary. "Your mother's final release package," Jonah said evenly. "Per her instructions, 1 month after her passing." "She's dead?" Evan blinked. "And I wasn't told?" Jonah stared at him. "She died in her own bed, with her own name. That's more than you gave her." Evan didn't respond. His fingers hovered over the envelope, hesitant. Jonah didn't wait. "Inside is the revised estate plan, letters, asset documentation, and a personal manuscript. It's not for public consumption. Just for you." When Evan finally opened it, alone, that night after Kimber had gone to bed, he started with the letter. The first line read, "I heard everything you didn't know I heard. Every word you said about me when you thought I couldn't hear you. When you thought my silence meant I was already gone." The second line was worse. "You said, 'She's just waiting to die.' So I waited. Just long enough to erase you from everything I owned." He read the rest with shaking hands. The legal filings confirmed it. The trust was gone. The property donated. The accounts liquidated into grants. And the manuscript, what I remember, the version that includes me. His name scattered across pages in ways he couldn't redact. Not vicious. Just factual. Honest. Brutal because it was true. No legacy, no money, no mention in the obituary, not even a photo in the dedication wall. At the community center, they held a dedication the following week. It was standing room only. Former volunteers, shelter residents, neighbors, librarians, children who now read because she did. One by one, they shared pieces of her, lemon bars from the cookbook, excerpts from her stories, and framed pages of her let-go list, hung like art. A small brass plaque gleamed beneath the new reading nook bench, in honor of Frances Delaney Parker. She left with nothing owed. Lorna stood beside it in a navy dress, her cane in one hand and a pie plate in the other. She spoke once, briefly. She didn't forgive people who confused inheritance with love. She didn't wait to be chosen. She chose herself. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. No one from Evan's family showed up. No flowers, no calls. Just absence. Loud, obvious, unmissed. Lorna sat alone that night in Frances's favorite chair, flipping through the final pages of the cookbook. A post-it was tucked into the back cover. She pulled it free and unfolded it. Frances's handwriting. My grandson said, "You're just waiting to die." So I waited just long enough to erase him from everything I owned. Lorna smiled. Then she set the note back in its place, closed the book, and turned off the light.